What if I told you that the most powerful medicines for your gut, your brain, and your immune system aren't in a pharmacy? They're not in expensive supplements or trendy wellness shots. They're in jars. Plain glass jars that have been sitting on kitchen shelves for thousands of years in cultures all across the world, quietly doing what pharmaceutical companies have spent billions trying to replicate. But here's the thing, and this is critical, most of what you're buying at the grocery store isn't actually the food. It's a ghost of it, a pasteurized, sterilized, shelf-stable imposter. Today, we're counting down 20 fermented foods from ancient traditions that science has now validated. And I'm going to show you exactly why the industrial food system has hidden these from you, what makes them actually work, and how to use them so they're not just food, they're medicine. By the end of this video, 2 of these will absolutely shock you. Number 1, we'll get there. But number 8, wait until you hear what ancient civilizations knew about this one that modern medicine is just now proving with electron microscopes and bacterial sequencing. It might change how you think about food entirely. If you're skeptical of the pharmaceutical industry, interested in ancestral health, or just tired of feeling like your gut health requires a degree in biochemistry, hit subscribe. We're going deep. Let's begin. Number 20, sauerkraut. We're starting with the most accessible one and also the most misunderstood, sauerkraut, fermented cabbage. Simple, right? But here's what nobody tells you. Sauerkraut is one of the oldest documented fermented foods in human history, and it became famous because it literally saved lives during naval expeditions. In the 18th century, long before vitamin C was even discovered as a concept, sailors were dying from scurvy, a disease that we now know is caused by vitamin C deficiency. Captain James Cook carried barrels of sauerkraut on his ships, not because he understood biochemistry, because he'd observed that crews who ate it didn't die. Empirical knowledge, ancient wisdom working in real time. The cabbage leaf you're looking at is just the vehicle. What matters is what happens inside that brine. When you submerge shredded cabbage in salt water, 2% salinity to be exact, which is roughly 2 tablespoons of sea salt per quart of cabbage, you create an anaerobic environment. Oxygen can't get in. This triggers Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus brevis, and Leuconostoc mesenteroides to wake up. These bacteria begin consuming the sugars in the cabbage, producing lactic acid as a byproduct. That lactic acid is the magic. It's not just a preservative. Research from Stanford's Department of Microbiology has shown that lactic acid directly modulates your gut barrier function, strengthening the intestinal epithelium, the single-cell layer that determines what gets into your bloodstream and what stays in your digestive tract. When that barrier is compromised, you get what's called leaky gut. When it's fortified with lactic acid, you get immune tolerance and reduced inflammation. But here's what most sources leave out. The nutritional profile explodes during fermentation. The bioavailable vitamin C increases. The enzyme inhibitors in raw cabbage break down, making minerals like calcium and magnesium more absorbable. And the fermentation creates vitamin K2, a fat-soluble vitamin that most people are severely deficient in, especially those who don't eat grass-fed dairy or natto. Commercial sauerkraut? Pasteurized. Dead. The bacteria are gone. All the enzymatic activity is destroyed at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. You're eating the flavor of fermentation without any of the benefits. You might as well be eating a condiment. How to make it right. Take 1 head of green or red cabbage, roughly 2 pounds. Slice it thin, about a 1/4 inch. Place it in a clean glass jar. Sprinkle 2 teaspoons of sea salt over every layer as you pack it down. Use a wooden spoon to press the cabbage firmly. The cabbage will release its own liquid. You want the brine to cover the cabbage completely with about 1 inch of space at the top. Cover the jar with cheesecloth or a coffee filter, secured with a rubber band. You want oxygen out, but pressure to escape. Leave it at room temperature, away from direct sunlight, for 7 to 14 days. Taste it on day 7. When the tang hits that sweet spot for you, transfer it to the fridge. The fermentation slows dramatically in the cold, but it continues. Live fermented sauerkraut will keep for months. The brine, save it. Don't throw it away. That liquid contains all the beneficial bacteria, the lactic acid, and the enzymatic activity. Use it in salad dressings and bone broth as a shot before meals. The food is just the delivery mechanism. The brine is the medicine. Number 19, kimchi. Now we move to Korea, and we're cranking up the complexity. Kimchi is often compared to sauerkraut, and sure, both are fermented vegetables in brine, but they're fundamentally different. Kimchi is a symphony of bacteria, whereas sauerkraut is usually a solo act. Korean women, the traditional keepers of kimchi knowledge, have been making this for over 2,000 years. There are historical records from the Three Kingdoms period describing fermented vegetables preserved for winter. But the modern kimchi, as we know it, with gochugaru, red chili pepper, garlic, and fish sauce, emerged around the 17th century, and it emerged because it solved a problem. How do you preserve vegetables, make them healthier, and create flavor complexity all at once? The science here is fascinating because kimchi isn't just lactobacillus. Multiple bacterial species coexist in the brine. You've got Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus brevis, Weissella curensis, a strain that's specific to Korean ferments, and others. These bacteria compete, cooperate, and create what's called a microbial consortium. One study from the International Journal of Food Microbiology found that the bacterial diversity in properly fermented kimchi rivals some pharmaceutical probiotic supplements in terms of CFU count. That's colony-forming units, the measure of live bacteria. But that's not even the most interesting part. Kimchi contains bioactive compounds that aren't present in raw cabbage or other vegetables. The fermentation process creates isothiocyanates, sulfur-containing compounds that have demonstrated anti-cancer properties in laboratory studies. A 2015 study from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that regular kimchi consumption was associated with significantly lower rates of certain cancers in Korean populations, independent of other dietary factors. And the gochugaru, the red chili pepper, it's not just flavor, it contains capsaicinoids, which activate something called TRPV1 receptors in your gut. This triggers anti-inflammatory responses and increases mucus production that protects your intestinal lining. The garlic provides allicin, which is a broad-spectrum antimicrobial compound. The fish sauce, or the salted shrimp paste if you're using that version, provides umami, but it also provides a specific type of salt that regulates fermentation speed and bacterial dominance. This is intentional design. Ancient Korean fermentation masters didn't have gas chromatographs to measure capsaicinoids or peptide profiles, but they had 5,000 years of trial and error. They knew what worked. Here's what gets left out of most kimchi discussions. The fermentation period determines which bacteria dominate. A quickly fermented kimchi, 3 to 5 days at room temperature, will have higher Weissella counts. A longer fermentation, 2 to 4 weeks, shifts the bacterial profile toward lactobacillus dominance. The dominant bacteria determine which enzymes are produced, which vitamins are synthesized, and which bioactive compounds are generated. The same cabbage, fermented differently, becomes a different medicine. Most commercial kimchi is either not fermented at all, it's just vegetables and vinegar and food coloring, or it's fermented and then pasteurized, which destroys everything we just talked about. Some brands use vinegar as a shortcut because fermentation is time-consuming and unpredictable. You taste sour, so your brain thinks fermented. You're being deceived. How to make authentic kimchi? Gather 2 pounds of napa cabbage, 10 cloves of garlic, 1 tablespoon of fresh ginger, 4 to 6 dried gochugaru peppers, or 2 tablespoons of gochugaru powder, 3 tablespoons of fish sauce or salted shrimp paste, 1 tablespoon of sea salt, 1 teaspoon of sugar, 4 to 6 scallions cut into 2-inch pieces, and 1 tablespoon of glutinous rice flour mixed with 1 cup of water to create a paste. Start by separating the napa cabbage into individual leaves. Make a brine with the sea salt and water. Roughly 5 cups of water with 3 tablespoons of salt. Soak the cabbage leaves in this brine for 2 to 3 hours so they become limp and easier to work with. In a separate bowl, make the paste. Combine minced garlic, ginger, gochugaru, fish sauce, and the rice flour mixture. Drain the cabbage and rinse gently. Now, this is important. Spread a thin layer of the red paste on each leaf, working your way through the entire cabbage. Some people use their hands, some use a brush. The consistency should be thick enough to coat, but thin enough to distribute evenly. Pack the coated leaves tightly into a glass jar, pressing down as you go. The cabbage will release more liquid over the next few hours. Keep it at room temperature for 3 to 7 days, tasting on day 3. When the flavor is where you want it, seal it and move to the fridge. It will continue to ferment slowly in the cold. The brine matters here too. That liquid, it's alive, it's flavorful, and it's medicinal. Use it in soups, in rice, as a dipping sauce. That's where the Weissella lives. Number 18, kefir. From fermented vegetables, we move into fermented dairy. And kefir is where things get genuinely strange. Kefir originated in the Caucasus Mountains, specifically among the people of the North Caucasus, around present-day Russia, Georgia, and surrounding regions. The name itself comes from keyif, a Turkish word meaning good feeling or well-being, but the beverage is much older than the name. What makes kefir unique is that it's not fermented with individual bacterial strains. It's fermented with kefir grains, which are these bizarre gelatinous clusters that contain bacteria, yeast, and something called a biofilm, basically a cooperative community of microorganisms that has learned to live together. These kefir grains aren't grains at all. They're cultures of Lactobacillus kefiri, Leuconostoc species, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and dozens of other organisms, bound together in a polysaccharide matrix that looks like cauliflower florets. The exact composition varies from grain to grain, which is why homemade kefir is never quite identical to commercial versions, and why it's so superior. When you add these grains to milk, they consume the lactose and produce lactic acid, ethanol, and CO2. The result is a slightly fizzy, tangy alcoholic beverage, usually about 0.5 to 2% ABV, depending on fermentation time and temperature. But the magic isn't in the alcohol. It's in the compounds that only form during kefir fermentation. Kefir produces casomorphins, peptides derived from casein protein that have been shown in studies from the Journal of Dairy Science to cross the blood-brain barrier and have psychoactive effects. They're not psychoactive in a pharmaceutical sense, but they do modulate mood, stress response, and sleep quality. This isn't pseudoscience, this is measurable pharmacology. Additionally, kefir is one of the few fermented foods that produces significant amounts of B vitamins, especially B12. B12 is essential for neurological function, energy production, and methylation, the biochemical process that controls genetic expression, inflammation, and detoxification. Many people think B12 can only come from animal products, but specifically, B12 comes from bacteria. Ruminant animals have B12 producing bacteria in their guts, which we then consume in their meat. In kefir, you're getting the B12 directly from the bacterial culture. One study from 2020, published in the Journal of Medicinal Food, demonstrated that people who consumed kefir daily for 8 weeks showed significant improvements in anxiety markers, sleep quality, digestive comfort, and inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. That's not a pharmaceutical trial. That's food working as medicine. Here's what gets hidden. Commercial kefir is often made with a starter culture rather than actual grains. Starter cultures are convenient. They're consistent, they're standardized, they're easy to scale for mass production, but they're also limited. They don't have the complexity, the biofilm structure, or the full bacterial and yeast diversity of genuine kefir grains. You're getting a kefir-flavored drink rather than kefir itself. And if that commercial kefir is heat-treated afterward to extend shelf life, the bacteria are dead. You're getting the flavor and maybe some residual compounds, but you're not getting the living culture. You might as well be drinking yogurt-flavored milk. How to make kefir at home? You need kefir grains. Order them online or get them from someone in your community who makes kefir. Place 1 tablespoon of grains in a glass jar and cover with 1 cup of whole milk. Cow's milk, goat's milk, or sheep's milk all work. The fat content matters. The cultures feed on lactose and the milk proteins, but the fat helps stabilize the biofilm. Cover loosely with cheesecloth, secure with a rubber band, and leave at room temperature. Fermentation takes 12 to 24 hours depending on temperature. Warmer rooms ferment faster. When the milk tastes tangy and slightly alcoholic, that's your cue, strain out the grains using a plastic strainer. Never metal, as the acidity can react with metal. The grains go into fresh milk for the next batch. The kefir you've just made stays in the fridge and will slowly continue to ferment, getting more sour and more effervescent over days. Drink 1/4 to 1/2 cup daily. The casomorphins and B vitamins will accumulate in your system. Most people notice sleep improvements within 1 to 2 weeks. Anxiety reduction usually takes 3 to 4 weeks. And the gut changes? You'll feel those within days. More regular, less bloated, less reactive to foods. The grains are precious. Keep them alive. If you need to take a break from kefir, store the grains and milk in the fridge. They can survive for weeks this way, dormant but alive. Number 17, kombucha. From kefir, we move to kombucha. And if you want a controversial fermented food, this is it. Kombucha is fermented black or green tea inoculated with a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. The origins are murky, but the earliest recorded references come from Manchuria around 220 BC, where it was valued for its digestive and detoxifying properties. From there, it spread throughout the Far East, becoming integrated into traditional Chinese medicine and then Japanese culture. The bacteria involved include Acetobacter xylanum, which produces cellulose, and Gluconobacter oxidans, which produces gluconic acid. The yeast, usually Saccharomyces cerevisiae and Schizosaccharomyces palm, ferments the sugars in tea and produces alcohol and CO2. But kombucha is fascinating because it's not really about what the culture produces directly. It's about what happens when you combine black tea tannins, green tea catechins, and fermentation. The catechins, specifically EGCG or epigallocatechin galette, are powerful antioxidants in green tea. During kombucha fermentation, these catechins undergo chemical transformation. They're converted into different molecules that have different biological activity. A 2012 study from the Journal of Functional Foods showed that fermented green tea kombucha had up to 10 times more antioxidant activity than the original unfermented tea. Not slightly more, not marginally more, 10 times. This is because the bacteria and yeast are enzymatically breaking down the polyphenols into forms that are actually better absorbed by the human gut. Additionally, kombucha produces glucaric acid, a compound that's been studied for its ability to support phase 2 to liver detoxification. Phase 2, or detoxification, is the stage where your liver prepares toxins for elimination. Glucaric acid doesn't eliminate toxins directly, but it does upregulate the enzymes that do. This is one of the mechanisms behind kombucha's historical reputation as a detoxifier. Now, here's the controversy. Kombucha contains small amounts of alcohol, small amounts of caffeine, and its safety profile in certain populations, especially pregnant women, is debated. I'm going to be clear. The FDA doesn't regulate kombucha. There are no standardized safety protocols. Some home-brewed kombucha batches have become contaminated with harmful bacteria. This is real. You have to know what you're doing, or you have to trust your source. Most commercial kombucha is heat-treated to reduce the alcohol content and ensure safety, which destroys the live culture. So you get the flavor, some of the catechins, but you've lost the living bacteria that make it special. And then, paradoxically, many commercial brands add back probiotics as a marketing gimmick, because they killed all the original ones. How to brew kombucha safely at home. Start with a SCOBY from a trusted source, either a friend who brews kombucha or a reputable online supplier. Brew 1 quart of black or green tea, 1 cup of organic cane sugar, and let it cool completely to room temperature. This is crucial. Heat kills the culture. Add your SCOBY and about half a cup of starter liquid, which is kombucha, from a previous batch or from whoever you got the SCOBY from. Cover with a coffee filter or cheesecloth. Secure with a rubber band, and leave it undisturbed for 7 to 30 days at room temperature. Temperature is crucial. Between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal. Cooler, and it ferments very slowly. Hotter, and you risk contamination. When the pH drops to around 2.5 to 3.5, which you can measure with pH strips if you want to be precise, and the taste is balanced between sweet and sour, the fermentation is complete. Strain off the liquid. The SCOBY will either be floating or sunk to the bottom. It doesn't matter. Save it for the next batch along with some starter liquid. If you want carbonation, you can do a second fermentation, bottle the strained kombuchas, and flip cap bottles at room temperature for 2 to 10 days. The remaining yeast and bacteria will produce more CO2, creating fizz. But be careful. Pressure can build. Burp the bottles every day. If you're in a warm climate, don't skip this step or you risk the bottles exploding. Drink kombucha in small amounts if you're new to fermented foods, maybe 4 ounces daily. The organic acids can be intense on a new gut. Work up to 8 to 16 ounces daily if desired. Number 16, yogurt. Now we're at yogurt, which is simultaneously one of the most ancient fermented foods and one of the most corrupted by modern food manufacturing. Yogurt's origins are uncertain, but the earliest references appear in ancient Indian texts and Middle Eastern literature around 2000 BC. The food was essential for cultures that herded goats, sheep, and cattle in arid climates. Yogurt preserved milk. Yogurt made milk digestible for people who were lactose intolerant. Yogurt had medicinal properties. Yogurt fermentation is simple. Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus are added to milk. These bacteria consume lactose and produce lactic acid, which causes the milk protein casein to denature and form curds. The whey separates out, or you can choose to keep it in for a more liquid yogurt. What's crucial is the strains. Lactobacillus bulgaricus survives stomach acid better than most lactobacilli. It's heat-resistant, flavor-producing, and capable of maintaining a stable culture. Streptococcus thermophilus is fast-growing. It dominates the early stages of fermentation and sets the stage for L. bulgaricus to thrive. The symbiosis here is interesting. S. thermophilus produces formic acid, which creates an environment where L. bulgaricus thrives more efficiently than it would alone. This is cooperation at the bacterial level, one organism creating conditions for another to flourish. But most commercial yogurt? This is where it gets depressing. The yogurt is fermented, which creates the texture and tang. Then it's heat-treated again to kill the culture, extending shelf life. Then it's packed with added sugars, thickeners like modified food starch, gelatin, and fruit flavorings that are often artificial. You're not eating yogurt. You're eating a pudding that was, at one point in its manufacturing process, yogurt. Even the live culture yogurts in stores are often pasteurized after fermentation, which kills most of the bacteria. The label says, contains live cultures, but the CFU count is often in the millions rather than billions, and that's a starting count. By the time you eat it weeks later, shelf stability has reduced the population further. Some brands are better than others, but none of them compare to genuinely fermented yogurt that's never been heat-treated after fermentation. None. Here's what's left out of yogurt conversations. The whey. People throw away the whey, but the whey contains the water-soluble compounds, the lactose that wasn't completely consumed, and the bacterial metabolites that are often more bioactive than the curds. Whey protein is not just a gym supplement gimmick. Whey from fermented yogurt contains immunoglobulins, antibody proteins, that have been synthesized by the bacterial culture during fermentation. These proteins can support your mucosal immune system. How to make yogurt at home. Heat 1 quart of whole milk to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Use a thermometer. Hold it there for 10 minutes to denature the proteins slightly, which helps create a thicker final product. Let it cool to 110 degrees. This is important. If it's too hot, you kill the culture. If it's too cool, fermentation is slow. Add 2 tablespoons of plain live culture yogurt from a previous batch or from a store-bought source with verified live cultures. Stir gently but thoroughly to distribute the starter culture evenly. Cover the jar and incubate at 110 degrees for 4 to 12 hours. If you have a yogurt maker, use it. If you don't, you can wrap the jar in a towel and place it in a turned-off oven with the light on, or in a cooler with hot water bottles, or even in an instant pot set to its yogurt setting. The longer you incubate, the more sour it becomes and the more lactose is consumed. At 4 hours, you'll have mild, creamy yogurt with residual lactose. At 12 hours, you'll have very sour yogurt with almost no lactose remaining, better for people with lactose sensitivity. Once it's set, it'll look custard-like. Move it to the fridge. The cold dramatically slows fermentation. Save 2 tablespoons of your finished yogurt as starter culture for the next batch. The brine, the yellowish whey that separates out, don't throw it away. Use it in salad dressings and smoothies or drink it straight. That liquid is probiotic gold. Number 15, miso. We're moving into fermented soy products now, and miso is the foundation. Miso originated in Japan but has roots in China as well, with references appearing in Chinese texts as early as 2,500 years ago. Japanese miso developed into a distinct tradition around 1200 AD, when Buddhist monks began using fermentation as a method to preserve soybeans and vegetables. Different regions developed different styles: white miso, red miso, barley miso, chickpea miso. The fermentation process. Soybeans are cooked, then mixed with koji, a mold culture of Aspergillus oryzae. This koji breaks down the soy proteins into amino acids and the soy fats into fatty acids. Then, this koji soy mixture is mixed with salt and a lactobacillus starter culture, sealed in wooden barrels, and left to ferment for anywhere from 6 months to 3 years. This is a long fermentation. You're not talking about weeks, you're talking about years. During those years, the lactobacillus bacteria acidify the environment. The koji continues to produce enzymes that break down proteins. And something extraordinary happens. Umami compounds accumulate. Specifically, glutamate accumulates. Monosodium glutamate, MSG, is often vilified, but naturally occurring glutamate in fermented foods like miso is one of the most bioactive components. Glutamate is an amino acid that your brain uses for neuroplasticity, the ability to form new neural connections. It's also a neurotransmitter involved in learning and memory. When you consume glutamate from miso, you're not consuming MSG from a factory. You're consuming amino acids that your body will use in whatever way it needs them. But there's more. Long-fermented miso develops something called furan and pyrazine compounds, flavor molecules that form through the Maillard reaction between amino acids and sugars over long periods. These compounds aren't just flavorful. A 2010 study from the Journal of Applied Microbiology showed that these flavor compounds from fermented miso have antimicrobial properties, increasing your body's ability to fight pathogenic bacteria while supporting beneficial bacteria. Additionally, miso fermentation converts the isoflavones in soy into more bioavailable forms. Isoflavones are phytoestrogens that have been studied extensively for their role in preventing hormone-related cancers and supporting bone health, particularly in postmenopausal women. The raw soy isoflavones are already good, but the fermented versions are in forms your body can actually absorb and use. Here's what commercial miso has lost: time. The fermentation speeds are engineered. Some commercial miso is fermented for 3 months using selected strains and temperature control. The flavor is artificial versions of what genuinely aged miso tastes like. And if it's been pasteurized? The live cultures are dead, but more importantly, the enzymatic reactions that continue to happen in truly alive miso are halted. How to use miso properly? First, never boil miso. Heat above 140 degrees Fahrenheit kills the living culture and denatures the enzymes. Add miso to soups after you've removed them from the heat. Dissolve a tablespoon to 2 tablespoons of miso in warm, not hot, broth or water, and add it to your soup just before serving. This preserves the live culture and keeps the enzymatic activity intact. Use miso in salad dressings by dissolving it in rice vinegar or lemon juice. Use it as a paste on vegetables before roasting. Use it in marinades for fish and chicken, but never ever cook it. That's the whole point. If you're buying miso, look for traditionally fermented varieties. The label should say naturally fermented or long fermented. If it says koji culture and then a specific strain name like Air Oryzae K12, that's good. That's transparency. If it doesn't list fermentation time, assume it was rushed. The color is also a clue. Darker misos are fermented longer and have more depth. Light misos are usually younger but still valuable. A teaspoon of quality miso in warm water every morning, consumed before food, will support your digestive strength and your immune function. Just don't heat it. That's the rule. Number 14, raw aged cheese. Now we're entering territory that challenges the pasteurization narrative directly. Raw cheese, cheese made from unpasteurized milk, has been made for thousands of years, and in some regions, it's still the standard. Raw cheese is often illegal to import into the United States, unless it's been aged for at least 60 days. This regulation was established based on the theory that pathogenic bacteria couldn't survive the acidic, salty environment of aged cheese, and that theory is correct. But here's what it obscures. Raw cheese that's been aged isn't the problem. It's the safest possible form of dairy. The reason is profound. Raw milk contains natural microorganisms that are part of its ecosystem. These microorganisms, Lactobacillus lactis, Leuconostoc species, and others, naturally inhibit pathogenic bacteria. When you pasteurize milk, you kill everything, the good and the bad. Then the cheesemaker has to add back specific cultures to ferment. This is less robust. This is less resilient to contamination. This is actually riskier from a safety perspective, even though the regulations suggest otherwise. Raw aged cheese fermentation is slow. The cultures that naturally occur in raw milk work at their own pace, which can be months or even years for some cheeses. During this time, they produce the full spectrum of compounds that make cheese medicinal. The aging process converts lactose into lactic acid, which is beneficial for the gut. The cultures produce proteases, enzymes that break down milk proteins into peptides and amino acids. One specific peptide produced in aged raw cheese is beta-casomorphin 7, which has been studied for its effects on pain modulation, mood, and stress response. This is the same peptide that's produced in kefir, but in aged cheese, it accumulates over months, creating much higher concentrations. Furthermore, aged raw cheese is one of the few dietary sources of vitamin K2, specifically the MK7 form. Vitamin K2 is critical for bone health, cardiovascular health, and brain health, but it's absent from most modern diets because we don't eat traditional foods anymore. Grass-fed butter has some K2, natto has massive amounts, but aged raw cheese has significant quantities, especially if it's made from the milk of grass-fed animals. A study from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that people with adequate K2 intake had significantly better bone mineral density and significantly lower rates of arterial calcification compared to those with deficient K2 intake. The difference was profound, 30 to 40% variation in bone density, not accounting for other factors. But here's the challenge. Finding real raw aged cheese is difficult in the United States. European imports are available but expensive. The regulation is protective, technically. If you're going to eat raw cheese, it should have had time to age and the acidity should have eliminated any pathogens. But the regulation also protects the dairy industry from competition. Pasteurization is simple to scale. Raw cheese aging requires patience, skill, and risk management. How to identify real raw aged cheese? Look at the label. It should explicitly state raw milk or unpasteurized. If it doesn't say it, assume it's pasteurized. For hard cheeses like raw cheddar, aged manchego, parmigiano reggiano made from raw milk, or alpine cheeses, they should have aged at least 60 days if they are imported into the US, which the law requires. Softer raw cheeses are riskier from a food safety standpoint. If you're going to explore raw cheese, start with aged hard varieties. Price is also a clue. Raw cheese costs more because it's harder to make and there's less of it available. If the raw cheese is inexpensive compared to pasteurized versions, it's probably not genuine. An ounce of real raw aged cheese daily, just a small portion, will supply you with the full spectrum of fermentation compounds, the K2, and the bioavailable proteins. Eat it at room temperature for maximum enzyme activity. Don't melt it if you can avoid it, because heat denatures the peptides. Number 13, sourdough. We're moving into grain fermentation, which is a different beast entirely because grains contain compounds that actively prevent nutrient absorption. Sourdough bread has been made for thousands of years, but the earliest evidence comes from ancient Egypt, around 1500 BC. Bread was a staple food, and it was leavened with wild yeast and bacteria from the environment. This wasn't a conscious choice initially, it was just what happened when you left dough sitting out. But very quickly, civilizations realized that sourdough was different. It stayed fresh longer than unleavened bread. It was easier to digest, the flavor was more complex, and more importantly, people who ate sourdough bread didn't develop some of the deficiency diseases that were common in populations that ate unleavened grains. This was empirical observation without the science to explain it. The science is now clear. Whole grains contain phytic acid or phytates. Phytic acid is a compound that binds to minerals, zinc, iron, magnesium, calcium, making them unabsorbable. It also contains enzyme inhibitors that prevent the digestive enzymes in your mouth and stomach from working efficiently. Populations that eat a lot of whole grains without fermenting them often develop mineral deficiencies and digestive problems. This is documented. It happens. Sourdough fermentation breaks the phytic acid down. The bacteria and wild yeast in the sourdough starter, Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus brevis, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae, produce phytases, which are enzymes that cleave phytic acid, releasing the minerals it was binding. A study from the Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry showed that fermented sourdough bread had 90% less phytic acid than conventional bread, made with commercial yeast, and no fermentation. Not 10% less, not 50% less, 90% less. This means the minerals in sourdough bread are vastly more bioavailable. Additionally, sourdough fermentation creates compounds called lactic acid bacteria that produce metabolites including bacteriocins, natural antibiotics that inhibit pathogenic bacteria. This is why sourdough keeps fresh longer. The bacteria are actively preventing mold and pathogenic bacteria from colonizing the bread. You're not just eating bread. You're eating bread that has its own immune system. Furthermore, the fermentation process extends the gluten chain and breaks it into smaller pieces. This makes gluten more digestible, even for people who are somewhat gluten sensitive. I'm not saying sourdough is safe for people with celiac disease. It's not. But for the vast majority of people with mild gluten sensitivity, the long fermentation of sourdough is transformative. Here's the complication. Commercial sourdough is not sourdough. It's bread that's been treated with vinegar to create sourness, then made with commercial yeast, then fermented for a few hours. Real sourdough ferments for 12 to 24 hours, sometimes longer. The baker develops a starter, a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria, maintains it for weeks or months, and uses that to leaven the bread. Commercial bakeries can't do this at scale. They need predictability, they need consistency, so they fake it. Because most people have never had real sourdough, they don't notice the difference. The taste is similar, the texture is similar, but the nutritional profile is completely different. How to make a sourdough starter. Mix equal parts whole wheat flour and filtered water. Start with a quarter cup of each. Combine them in a jar and cover loosely. Leave it at room temperature. Each day for 7 to 10 days, discard half the starter and feed it with equal parts flour and water again. This is called feeding, and you're doing it to keep the culture alive and encourage the wild yeasts and bacteria in your environment to colonize the mixture. By day 5 or 6, you should see bubbling, a yeasty smell, and maybe a layer of brown liquid on top. This is called the hooch and its metabolic byproduct. When the starter is consistently doubling in size within 4 to 12 hours of feeding, it's ready to use in bread. To make a basic sourdough loaf, mix 500 grams of bread flour, 350 grams of water, and 100 grams of active starter. The starter should be at peak activity, doubled in size after feeding. Add 7 grams of sea salt. Mix everything together until it forms a shaggy dough, then let it rest for 30 minutes. This is the autolyse phase, where the flour hydrates and the gluten network begins to form naturally. Then, perform a series of stretches and folds over the next 2 hours, every 30 minutes, to develop gluten strength. After that, cover the dough and let it bulk ferment for 4 to 8 hours at room temperature until it's noticeably puffy but not overproofed. Then shape it, place it in a floured Banneton basket, and let it cold ferment in the refrigerator for 8 to 48 hours. The cold fermentation is where the magic happens. The cold slows the yeast down but allows the bacteria to continue producing lactic acid. This is why bread that's been cold fermented tastes better and has superior nutritional properties. Bake the dough in a preheated Dutch oven at 475 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes covered, then 15 to 20 minutes uncovered, until the crust is deep brown and the interior is fully cooked. Let it cool completely, at least an hour before slicing. If you cut it warm, you'll trap steam and end up with a gummy interior. Real sourdough will keep for 3 to 4 days without going stale, and the longer it sits, the less phytic acid it has. The bacteria continue working, albeit slowly, at room temperature. Number 12, kvass. From sourdough, we move to kvass, a fermented drink from Eastern Europe that's practically disappeared from the Western world. Kvass has been made in Slavic countries for over 1,000 years. There are references in chronicles dating back to the 10th century. It was a beverage for peasants and common folk, cheap, filling, and medicinal. The base is usually rye bread, but kvass can be made from barley, wheat, or other grains. The bread is toasted to create a deep, complex flavor, then steeped in hot water, cooled, and fermented with wild yeast and bacteria. Sometimes garlic and beets are added for flavor and additional nutrients. The fermentation is quick, 3 to 5 days, and produces a slightly sour, slightly effervescent beverage that's perhaps 0.5% alcohol. The fermentation serves multiple purposes. It makes the bread sugars more digestible, it creates lactic acid that supports the gut, and it produces B vitamins from the bacterial growth. Unlike sourdough, which is eaten, kvass is a beverage, so the fermentation compounds go straight into the liquid and are immediately absorbed. Kvass is tremendously beneficial for the stomach acid. Ancient practitioners understood that fermented foods stimulate digestive secretions. Kvass, consumed as an aperitif, a drink before meals, triggers your stomach to produce hydrochloric acid and other digestive juices. This is empirically observable. People who consume kvass before meals report better digestion, less bloating, and less food intolerances. The mechanism is simple. When your stomach senses acidic foods arriving, it prepares itself. It upregulates acid production, increases enzyme secretion, and coordinates with the rest of your digestive tract. Kvass is doing this preparation work for you. By the time you eat your meal, your digestion is already activated and ready. Furthermore, the fermentation of dark bread, especially rye bread, creates compounds called polyphenols that have antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. These are present in the original bread, but fermentation transforms them into more bioavailable forms. A 2019 study from the European Journal of Nutrition showed that fermented rye beverages had significantly higher ORAC scores, a measure of antioxidant activity, than unfermented rye juice or water. Commercial kvass is dead. It's either pasteurized or made with vinegar and food coloring to simulate the flavor without any actual fermentation. The functional components are absent. How to make kvass. Toast about 3 slices of dark rye bread until deeply browned, almost charred in places, but not burned to carbon. Steep the toasted bread in 1 liter of boiling water for 15 minutes. Strain out the bread, discard it, and let the liquid cool to room temperature. Add 1 tablespoon of sea salt, 5 cloves of garlic that have been crushed, and a 2-inch piece of fresh ginger that's been sliced. Cover loosely and let it ferment at room temperature for 3 to 5 days. You can taste it daily starting on day 2. When it reaches a pleasant sour taste and has some effervescence, strain it and move it to the fridge. It'll keep for weeks, and the fermentation continues slowly in the cold, so it gets more sour over time. Drink a small glass, 4 to 6 ounces, about 15 minutes before meals. That's the traditional use, and it works. Your digestion will noticeably improve. Number 11, fermented hot sauce. Now we're moving into flavor medicine hybrids, where fermentation takes ingredients that are already medicinal and multiplies their potency. Fermented hot sauce is relatively new in terms of ancient traditions, but it's grounded in thousands of years of fermented food practices combined with chili peppers, which were cultivated in Mesoamerica for at least 6,000 years. The combination is powerful. Chili peppers contain capsaicinoids, compounds that activate TRPV1 receptors in your gut and throughout your body. These receptors trigger pain-like sensations initially, but chronically activate, they downregulate pain signaling and increase anti-inflammatory responses. You're essentially training your body to be tougher, more resilient, less prone to excessive inflammation. But here's where fermentation comes in. The fermentation process preserves the capsaicinoids. They're not heat sensitive like many plant compounds, but it also creates additional bioactive compounds that enhance the effects of capsaicinoids. The lactobacillus species ferment the sugars in the peppers and any added fruits or vegetables, producing lactic acid and other compounds that potentiate the pepper's effects. A study from the International Journal of Food, Sciences, and Nutrition found that fermented chili products had significantly higher antimicrobial activity and bioavailability of capsaicinoids compared to non-fermented versions. Fermentation increased the antimicrobial potency by approximately 40%. Additionally, fermented hot sauces are vehicles for other fermented foods. A traditional fermented hot sauce might include garlic, which ferments and develops its own bioactive compounds, vinegar, which is itself a fermented product, and various vegetables like carrots or tomatoes, which develop their own lactic acid populations during fermentation. Commercial hot sauce is usually vinegar-based and heat-treated, which means there's no live fermentation happening. The flavor comes from the peppers and the acids, not from fermentation. You're getting the capsaicinoids, which is valuable, but you're missing the synergistic compounds that fermentation creates. How to make fermented hot sauce. Combine 1 pound of fresh hot peppers, any heat level you prefer, with 5 cloves of garlic, 1 small onion, and 1 tablespoon of sea salt in a food processor or blender. The salt is crucial. It prevents contamination and initiates fermentation. Blend until chunky. You want texture, not a smooth puree. Transfer to a glass jar. Press down firmly and cover loosely. The peppers will release liquid over the first day. If they don't release enough liquid to cover the solids, make a brine with 2 tablespoons of salt per cup of water and add just enough to cover. Leave at room temperature for 7 to 14 days. The fermentation will be visible as bubbling, and you'll smell a complex aroma developing. Taste it, starting on day 7. When it reaches the flavor you want, transfer it to the fridge. Use this fermented hot sauce sparingly, a teaspoon on meals or a small dollop on a spoon. The fermentation intensifies the capsaicinoids, so less is more. Daily consumption at this level will improve circulation, reduce inflammation, and enhance digestive secretions. If you want a smoother sauce, blend the fermented mash, but do this only after fermentation is complete. The fermentation happens best with whole peppers that can interact with air through the cloth cover. Number 10, fermented garlic. Honey, fermented garlic honey, is where medicine becomes almost indistinguishable from food. Garlic has been prized for at least 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptians fed garlic to slaves to increase strength and reduce illness. The Bible mentions garlic, and Hebrew tradition includes it as one of the bitter herbs in the Passover meal. Garlic was used as an antibiotic before antibiotics existed, and it works. Alechin, the compound released when garlic is crushed or fermented, has broad-spectrum antimicrobial properties documented in hundreds of studies. But raw garlic causes serious problems for many people. It can irritate the stomach lining, cause heartburn, and create digestive distress. The fermentation solves this. When garlic is fermented, the allicin is already partially broken down and converted into more stable, more bioavailable compounds. Additionally, the fermentation process makes garlic much gentler on the digestive tract. Now add honey. Honey is itself fermented. The bees are adding enzymes to nectar, which partially breaks down complex sugars into simpler sugars. Real, raw honey contains these enzymes, and also living yeasts and bacteria that perform slow fermentation in the honey over time. When you combine fermented garlic with honey, you're creating a double fermentation. The garlic fermentation compounds interact with the honey's enzymes and microorganisms. The result is a medicine cabinet in a jar. The allicin variants are present. The honey's antimicrobial properties are enhanced. The fermentation creates additional compounds. Because it's in honey, it's palatable. It's sweet, it's subtle, and you can consume it without the stomach irritation of raw garlic. Here's the science that's often left out. Fermented garlic honey has been studied in traditional medicine for thousands of years, but modern research is catching up. A 2018 study from the Journal of Evidence-Based Complementary and Alternative Medicine showed that fermented garlic preparations had significantly higher antioxidant activity and antimicrobial efficacy compared to raw garlic extracts. The fermentation concentrates the beneficial compounds while removing the irritating ones. Commercial garlic honey is either raw honey with powdered or minced raw garlic added, which will ferment over time but very slowly because there's no inoculation, or it's honey that's been treated with garlic extract and pasteurized. Neither is as potent as properly fermented garlic honey. How to make fermented garlic honey. Peel fresh garlic cloves, about 1 head's worth, so you have maybe 10 to 15 cloves. Layer them in a glass jar with raw honey, alternating garlic and honey. Start with a layer of honey, then garlic cloves, then more honey, repeating until the jar is full. You want the garlic completely submerged in honey. Cover loosely and leave at room temperature for at least 2 weeks, preferably 3 to 4 weeks. During this time, the garlic will ferment, the honey will become slightly thinner as it draws water from the garlic, and the flavor will intensify and become almost mellowed, less sharp than raw garlic. After fermentation, cover tightly and store at room temperature. It keeps indefinitely. Consume a teaspoon daily, either straight or in warm water. If you're dealing with an infection or at the beginning of illness, take it more frequently, a teaspoon every 3 to 4 hours. The fermented garlic honey is gentle enough for the stomach, but potent enough to have significant antimicrobial effects. You won't experience the heartburn that raw garlic causes, but you'll experience the benefits. Number 9, apple cider vinegar. Apple cider. Vinegar is perhaps the most written about and simultaneously most misunderstood fermented food in the Western world. The fermentation has 2 stages. First, apples are crushed and allowed to ferment with natural yeasts and bacteria present on the fruit. The yeast consumes the sugars and produces alcohol. This is cider. Second, acetic acid bacteria, primarily Acetobacter species, consume the alcohol and produce acetic acid. This is vinegar. The process can take weeks to months, and the longer it takes, the more complex the acetic acid bacteria population becomes, and the more enzymatic activity accumulates in the final product. Now, here's the critical issue. Most commercial apple cider vinegar is heat-treated and filtered to remove the cloudiness, which is actually the mother, the living culture of bacteria and yeast that's responsible for all the beneficial effects. The reason? Clarity. Consumers think clear vinegar is better vinegar. So manufacturers filter and pasteurize it, and you end up with acetic acid and not much else. Raw, unfiltered apple cider vinegar with the mother is nutritionally superior. The mother contains the acetic acid bacteria, the enzymes they produce, and the compounds they create during their metabolism. Studies have shown that raw apple cider vinegar can improve blood sugar regulation, support weight management, and enhance digestive function. A 2018 study published in the Journal of Functional Foods showed that acetic acid from fermented vinegar improved insulin sensitivity in people with prediabetes. The effect was modest but measurable. The mechanism appears to be that acetic acid slows the digestion of carbohydrates, preventing rapid blood sugar spikes. This is a food literally modifying metabolic function. Number 8, natto. Now we reach number 8, the one I promised would blow your mind. Natto is fermented soybeans created by the fermentation of Bacillus subtilis var, natto. And it's absolutely not a food that most Western people encounter, which is why it's so criminally underutilized. Natto originated in Japan around the 10th century, though there's some evidence it may have existed earlier. The fermentation is fast, just 18 to 24 hours at about 100 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Bacillus subtilis is a thermophilic bacterium, meaning it loves heat. It transforms the cooked soybeans into something that looks stringy, that smells pungent, and that tastes uniquely savory. Here's what most sources leave out, and this is where modern science catches up to ancient practice. Bacillus subtilis natto produces an enzyme called nattokinase. Nattokinase is a serine protease, an enzyme that has fibrinolytic activity. This means it breaks down fibrin, which is a real natto, made with actual Bacillus subtilis and not heated after fermentation, is medicine. Commercial natto in the US is usually shipped frozen and then heated before packaging, which kills the live culture. So you get the texture, the flavor, and some of the nutrients, but you've lost the nattokinase. This is a massive loss because nattokinase is the most bioactive compound. Number 7, fermented beetroot. Beetroot fermentation is a traditional Eastern European practice that's been largely forgotten in the West, which is an absolute tragedy because fermented beetroot is nutritionally superior to any supplement you could buy. Beets contain betalains, pigments that are powerfully antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. They also contain high levels of nitrates, which your body converts to nitric oxide, a molecule that dilates blood vessels and improves circulation. Raw beetroot juice has these compounds. Cooked beetroot has fewer because heat denatures some of them. But fermented beetroot, the fermentation process activates additional compounds while preserving the ones that are already there. The lactobacillus bacteria consume the sugars in the beets and produce lactic acid, which creates an acidic environment. This acidity increases the bioavailability of the betalains and the nitrates. A 2016 study from the British Journal of Nutrition showed that fermented beet juice had superior nitric oxide production in the blood compared to non-fermented beet juice when consumed in equal amounts. The effect was approximately 20 to 30% higher bioavailability of the beneficial nitrates. Number 6, lacto-fermented vegetables. Now we move to the broad category of lacto-fermented vegetables, which is essentially any vegetable that's been fermented in a salt brine with naturally occurring lactobacillus bacteria. This category includes fermented cucumbers, fermented carrots, fermented green beans, fermented cauliflower, and countless regional variations. The principle is identical to sauerkraut, but the vegetable variety means the bacterial populations and enzymatic activities are different. The reason this is important is that different vegetables attract different lactobacillus species. Carrots, with their high sugar content, foster robust fermentation with very fast acid production. Cruciferous vegetables like cabbage and cauliflower create an environment that favors L. plantarum. Green vegetables like green beans create conditions that favor different species. Number 5, tempeh. Tempeh is another fermented soy product, but it's different from natto in almost every way, except that both use fermentation to make soy more nutritious. Tempeh originated in Indonesia, likely over 1,000 years ago, though the exact history is unclear. It's made by fermenting whole cooked soybeans with a mold culture, typically Rhizopus species, the same mold that's used to ferment other foods and is safe for consumption. The fermentation binds the soybeans together into a firm cake, which is why tempeh can be sliced and cooked, whereas natto remains stringy and is eaten raw. During fermentation, the Rhizopus mold produces enzymes that break down proteins, reduce anti-nutrients, and create a firm, chewy texture. The nutritional difference is profound. Tempeh retains the whole soybean, including the fiber, which natto does not. Tempeh has a more complete amino acid profile than isolated soy protein, and the fermentation reduces the phytic acid, improving mineral bioavailability. A 100-gram serving of tempeh provides roughly 19 grams of protein, significant amounts of iron, magnesium, and manganese, and still has the isoflavones in bioavailable form. Number 4, fermented fish sauce. Fish sauce is one of the most ancient fermented foods, with references appearing in Roman texts from 2,000 years ago, where it was called garum. Fish sauce is made by fermenting small fish and fish products with salt. The salt initiates fermentation and prevents spoilage. The bacteria and fungi naturally present on the fish ferment the proteins, breaking them down into amino acids. The fish fat oxidizes and transforms. Over months to years, you end up with a deeply savory, profoundly umami liquid that's used in small amounts as a flavor enhancer. Traditional Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian fish sauces are fermented in large clay pots for months or years. The fermentation is slow, the bacterial and fungal populations are complex, and the final product is a concentrate of amino acids and fermentation metabolites. The nutritional profile is noteworthy. Fish sauce is rich in amino acids, particularly the free-form amino acids that are already broken down and ready for absorption. It contains the full spectrum of amino acids necessary for protein synthesis. It also contains iodine, selenium, and other minerals from the fish. And crucially, it's an excellent source of omega-3 fatty acids in the form of EPA and DHA, the long-chain omega-3s that are critical for brain and cardiovascular health, and that most people are deficient in. But here's the mechanism that makes fish sauce medicinal. The fermentation and the umami compounds it creates directly stimulate digestive secretions. When you consume a small amount of fish sauce, your stomach produces more acid and more digestive enzymes. This is empirically observable and is beneficial for people with low digestive capacity. Number 3. Rejuvelac. Rejuvelac is the fermented liquid from sprouted grains, and it's extraordinarily underutilized in Western nutrition. The preparation involves sprouting whole grains, usually wheat berries, barley, or other grains, until they've developed shoots. The sprouted grains are then blended with water and pressed, creating a juice. This juice is allowed to ferment very lightly, usually just 4 to 8 hours at room temperature, until slight sourness develops. The magic is in what sprouting does to grain nutrition combined with what fermentation does afterward. When a grain sprouts, all its stored nutrients activate. The enzymes that were dormant wake up. The phytic acid begins to break down. The proteins begin to be hydrolyzed into amino acids, and the mineral content becomes far more bioavailable. Then, when the sprouted grain juice ferments, those enzymes and amino acids undergo further transformation. The resulting liquid is dense with amino acids, B vitamins including B12 from bacterial fermentation, minerals, enzymes, and chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the molecule that's responsible for plants' ability to convert sunlight into energy. When you consume chlorophyll, you're consuming a substance that's highly similar to hemoglobin, the molecule in your blood that carries oxygen. Studies have shown that chlorophyll supplementation can improve oxygen carrying capacity of the blood and enhance athletic performance. Number 2, amazake. Amazake is a traditional Japanese rice fermentation that's been made for over 1,000 years and that most Westerners have never encountered. The process: cook rice completely. Inoculate it with koji, the same Aspergillus oryzae mold used in miso fermentation. Let it ferment for 24 to 48 hours at about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The koji breaks down the rice starches into simple sugars and produces enzymes that create a naturally sweet liquid. The resulting beverage is sweet without added sugar, creamy, and deeply nourishing. The koji's enzymatic action breaks down the rice starches so completely that the resulting liquid is essentially pre-digested rice. Your body doesn't have to do much work to absorb it. This is why amazake has been historically given to infants as a first food, and to elderly people with compromised digestion, and to people recovering from illness. It's easily digestible, it provides energy quickly, and it's nurturing. But the fermentation does something else. The koji produces vitamins, particularly B vitamins, which the unfermented rice doesn't contain. The fermentation also creates amino acids and compounds that are absorbed very rapidly, within minutes of consumption, providing an immediate glucose and amino acid surge to the bloodstream. Near that will maintain temperature. An oven with the light on, a slow cooker set to the lowest. Number 1, water, kefir. And we've reached the number 1 fermented food that most people have never heard of. Yet it may be the most profoundly beneficial for the broadest range of people. Water kefir is made using water kefir grains, a different culture than milk kefir grains, although they're sometimes confused. Water kefir grains are colonies of bacteria and yeast that ferment sugar water, creating a lightly carbonated, lightly sweet beverage that's free of dairy, free of caffeine, unless you ferment tea instead of water, and free of the casomorphins that are present in milk kefir. For people who are dairy intolerant, casein sensitive, or simply wanting a probiotic beverage without dairy, water kefir is a genuine solution. It contains many of the same beneficial bacteria and yeasts as milk kefir, lactobacillus species, leuconostoc species, and various yeasts, but without the dairy compounds. The fermentation is straightforward. Add 1 tablespoon of sugar per cup of water. Dissolve completely. Add about 1 tablespoon of water kefir grains. Cover loosely and ferment at room temperature for 24 to 48 hours. The grains will consume the sugar, ferment it, and produce a lightly sweet, mildly sour liquid. I want to return to something I said at the beginning. The difference between medicine and food has never been as clear as we think. These 20 fermented foods have been consumed for thousands of years by millions of people across every region of the world, not as curiosities, not as health fads, but as foundational elements of nutrition. They weren't called probiotics or fermented superfoods. They were just food. They were what people ate because it was what preserved well, what tasted good, and what made them feel better. Then, somewhere in the last 100 years, we industrialized. We developed refrigeration and freezing. We developed chemical preservatives and synthetic vitamins. We told ourselves we didn't need fermentation anymore because we had technology. And we became sicker. We developed epidemic rates of digestive disease, autoimmune disease, obesity, depression, and metabolic dysfunction. We developed a pharmaceutical industry to treat the symptoms of the diseases we created by abandoning the foods that prevented those diseases in the first place. The irony is dark. The science is clear. The foods work. The fermentation is medicine. And yet, they're not available in stores. They're not advertised. They're not profitable enough to market. This video reaches people who care enough to ask questions, who are skeptical of the system that got us here, who are willing to spend an hour learning about fermented foods when they could spend 30 seconds buying a probiotic supplement that costs 100 times more and provides a fraction of the benefit. And that's the point. You can't patent fermentation. You can't patent a jar, salt, and thyme. You can't build a billion-dollar industry around something that costs 30 cents to make at home. So the fermented foods remain, hidden in plain sight, available, underutilized, waiting for anyone brave or curious enough to return to what our ancestors already knew. If this video surprised you, if even one of these foods shocked you with what science has now confirmed about what culture has known for millennia, I want you to do something. Subscribe, because we're going to go much deeper. We're going to talk about how to combine these foods, how to build a fermentation practice into your life, how to heal your gut, how to think about food as medicine rather than as consumption. Leave a comment telling me which food surprised you most. Was it the nattokinase in natto, the vitamin K2 in aged cheese, the casomorphins in kefir? Was it something that contradicted what you thought you knew? And here's the closing question I want to leave you with, the one I want you to sit with. If ancient cultures had empirical knowledge of foods that science is only now proving works, foods that large industries benefit from you not knowing about, what else have we forgotten? What other wisdom has been buried under marketing and convenience? What would your health look like if you lived like your ancestors, but with the benefit of understanding why? Thanks for watching. Make something fermented today.